Hi, I'm Norm Bacall, and I am a rewired lawyer, an author, and a TED Talker. I'm here to share with you the exciting elements of my life because I've done things I never could have imagined. I stepped out of the shadows of a boardroom where I was a nobody and eventually led boardroom meetings, became pals with a couple of prime ministers, rock stars, and media moguls in Los Angeles. I went through a collapse, a business collapse that had me question my own identity and how they were interlinked. I've lived by one philosophy, and that is, I'm never going to do it until I do it. Come join me on today's journey.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. What's in front of you that you maybe even secretly believe you can't do? We all have those things. Imagine yourself on the banks of a river. You've never seen this river before. You don't know what specifically formed the river, where the twists or the turns are, whether you will be in turbulent waters or smooth waters ahead. As leaders, we must constantly not only assess where we are going, but where we've been and where we are. We've got to look at all three things at the same time. Charting your course down the river of life, down the future of business and leadership can be challenging. Will you even get in the boat we get your boat in the water? Will you spend the time looking back at where you came from, maybe ignoring where it is you've been? Some people just ignore that. Will you hold your eyes on the goal and not pay attention to where you came from? Will you only be looking back and not looking forward? But as someone familiar with that sport will tell you, there are signs in the water. There's signs in the trees, in the bushes, at the side of the river. The river itself and the skies above all are filled with signs if you will pay attention to them. If you won't, you'll be in a whole lot of trouble. So, do you need to only look forward to hit a goal? Or do you need to slow down, pay attention, notice what's ahead of you, notice where you are, and look at where you came from? We'll talk more about that in a moment. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor. Get over to wherever it is you tune into the podcast. And it really helps us, so we really appreciate when you do it. Just rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really helps. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. By the way, I know you're curious. My name is Dov Baron. I'm your host, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Norman Bacall. Norman has had it all. He's been to the very top. He worked his way from obscurity to the top of his profession as a Canadian specialist in film, television, finance for 25 years, representing Canadian major productions and major film studios. He went on to build an iconic Canadian law firm that was home to 2 retired Canadian prime ministers. Yeah, they stopped being prime ministers and worked in his firm. He rewired himself in 2014 as a consultant to professional films, becoming a motivational speaker and an author. He's got 2 published nonfiction books and 2 murder mysteries. However, something happened to Norm and he fell fast and hard. Once he processed that pain and that hurt, he applied techniques that kickstarted him to his first winding journey to success in his 30s and seeing how he could reboot that in his 60s. Norm is living proof that with the right skills, tools, and mindset, you can do whatever it is that you are terrified of and become extremely successful in it. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Mr. Norman Bacall. And the crowd goes mad, young man. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. This reminds me of the TED Talk that I gave at Ryerson a few months ago when I was speaking supposedly to a huge auditorium full of students. Unfortunately, we were midway through COVID in Toronto, so the auditorium was actually empty, but for about the 5 organizers who I spaced around the audience, which was fantastic because at least I had some audience to speak to.
Some, yes.
Yeah. The only problem was when it came time to land the jokes, there was nobody in the audience to laugh. So the wild applause triggered that memory for me of hoping that my virtual audience at least was laughing.
Well, it's like Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert during COVID when they were telling jokes and there was no audience. They were saying how difficult that was. It's exactly the same, yeah.
It's a challenge.
So where we want to start is this. What's the origin story of what gives your life meaning? A lot of people think they know what the meaning of their lives is, and oftentimes it's not what it is. And oftentimes it takes a major, let's just call it a major event for them to get shook up a little bit and realize that maybe I need to re-examine that. What's the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
For me, it was actually just a few years ago. And it was at a point in time where I thought I had it all. As you pointed out earlier in the introduction, which was very kind of you, I built an iconic law firm. Not alone, I had help all the way along. Prime Minister Chrétien and Prime Minister Trudeau had both worked there. I had been leading the firm for 16 years, and I couldn't make a distinction between the firm and me. The firm was me. The firm's success was my success, and that's how I'd lived my life. And but 1 year after my term as leader expired, I was still at the firm contemplating what I was going to do next in life. And the firm collapsed quite dramatically. And in fact, the national media reported it as the greatest failure in Canadian law firm history.
Wow.
So imagine that you've created this and suddenly it's like the building has imploded underneath you.
So is that a round of applause to you? Because now you're not the leader anymore. You've gone away and the whole thing fell down. My goodness, we miss Norman.
No, hardly. There, believe me, what you're left with, as any of your listeners who've ever been involved in a business collapse will tell you, the strain of the final year, combined with the anger that everyone feels that needs to be directed somewhere, doesn't dissipate. And for many of my partners, it's now 8 years later. This happened in beginning of 2014. And I'd stepped in the last 3 months in a last the last ditch effort to try and save it. And as you can see, I failed. But many of my partners never processed their anger, and some of them still feel it, and possibly some of them will never speak to me again. I had to decide what to do with the rest of my life at that point in time. And it's funny, you mentioned the word rewirement before rather than retirement. And that's what I decided to do at the urging of my wife, who handed me a blank notepad, one of those nothing books that you and a pen, and said, "Here, you need to get your anger out of you." And so I sat down, and like the captain going down with the ship, I was sitting in my office overlooking Lake Ontario. It was Valentine's Day night, 2014. The place was empty. It was a tomb. And I decided to focus on that night, how it felt and what it looked like. And once I'd finished, I was still not prepared to confront everything that had happened in the final year. So I decided I was going to leave something for my kids. We had 4 of them, and because clearly there was no more monument, no name on the wall, no more organization or institution, and I was just going to start writing down my stories from really from law school all the way through until I could finally get to the last year. What started as something that I would do when I got home from work turned into a daily habit, although really what it became was a daily obsession. I was going at it 7 days a week at one point in time. I'd get home, I'd start writing at 9 after a day of work because had to keep earning a living at a new place, and accept that in that new place I was back to being a nobody. So it's kind of accepting that wasn't easy as well. But when I got through with the writing, and it was about 6 months later, I realized 2 things. One, I didn't feel angry anymore. The pain that I felt, I could see on the page. And I began an editing process. And I did 2 things at that point in time. I made a call to a client of mine who was a film producer in California, and offered to send him a couple of chapters. And he actually sent back some script notes on it. He said, "Oh, it's an interesting story." Right. And that was part 1. Part 2 is I called an agent friend of mine and said, "Do you think there might be any interest in a book here? Because if there is, I will go about seriously undertaking to produce it." And he said, "How long is it?" I said, "Well, it's now 750 typed pages." He said, "Norm, call me back when it's under 300 because nobody's that interested in your life story."
No.
So that was the process I then undertook, and I eventually published Breakdown, which is the name of the book, which is really, it was a rise and fall story of the firm. It went on to become a Globe and Mail bestseller, and the process of my rewirement had begun. That was really the originating story of part 2 of my life, which also forced me to go back and confront part 1, and we can get to that later. I don't want to. So,
what was the meaning derived from all that for you?
It was a few things. One, when I looked at what was on the page, and it took a fellow by the name of Jonathan Kay, who used to work at the National Post, who was one of my early readers. He said, "Norm, what you've written are actually 3 books that have never been written before." He said, "Each one of them individually will work. But though I have no idea whether this will work when you put them together. But one is a case study on how to go from being a university student to a successful professional."
Yes.
A case study 2 is how to build an organization and what are the elements that go into it. And case study 3 is what is the glue that holds organizations together, and what do leaders need to? What are the lessons to be learned for leaders so that this doesn't happen to them, and how it can become so easily unglued. He said, so those are all interesting stories. And at that point in time, I understood my mission, which was as much as possible to give back to a city who gave me a wonderful life. I originally came from Montreal and started building when I arrived here in Toronto, really with nothing but a few clients in 1989. But it was a chance to give back at all different levels. So for students and young professionals, it was an opportunity to lecture on the university campuses, to offer my books for free, to go on LinkedIn, create a profile, and really give free advice to pretty much anybody who would ask for it in terms of how to manage their careers. At the leadership level, I began to speak at corporate retreats and understood that my role wasn't just to pass on lessons, but to try and motivate others to learn not only from my successes, but much more from my failures. And of course, going through all that teaches you quite a bit about humility.
Yeah, but I'm still not at it. I still want to know what was the meaning for you. Like, so you've given me the meaning of what it needs to do in the world, right? So it needs to do these things, but I don't know what the meaning was for you. And I know our listener loves to know that. Like, what meaning did you get this about, the way you'd lived your life versus the way you need to live your life? Because I always say, I use the analogy of falls because I fell off a mountain, right? And I say to people, what's really important to recognize is the fall is not there. It's there for two reasons. It's there to wake you up from, this is who you were, what you did, and it's to wake you up from that, and then to wake you up to what to do. But in between, the glue that holds those things together is to wake you up to who you really are. That's not in the behavior, not in the mission or the actions, but in like the essence, the meaning of who you are. What did it drive in you?
I spent 25 years building a business and becoming a leader. And I understood leadership to mean the person who's responsible to build the organization and to establish the corporate values. Mm-hmm. What the fall reinforced for me, or the pickup from the fall reinforced for me, is that there's so much more to leadership than that. Mm-hmm. And it's much more about the lasting impact that you can have on others. So it's not about how much money you make. It's not about how satisfied you keep your partners or your staff. It's about what kind of impact, and this was my wake-up call, what kind of impact can I have on people, not only knowingly, but far more important, unknowingly.
Yes.
And it also forced me to go back to conversations I'd had with others earlier in my career. And I would actually get in touch with them and say, I don't think you remember this, but you had a conversation with me 30 years ago that I have never forgotten. And of course, the response I get almost uniformly is, I have no idea what you're talking about now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have no memory of this. Right. And again, those are reinforcing lifetime moments when you realize the good you're doing in the world isn't necessarily what you think it is.
No,
it's all those things you have no idea you're doing.
Yeah, all those things you've forgotten. Yeah.
But you need to continue to put yourself in situations where you can do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate you digging a little deeper on that one. So you've written 2 fiction books, 2 nonfiction books, and I would love for you to share the "We're Going to Rock You All Night Long" connection. The Kiss connection.
Oh, the Kiss connection.
Right. For those of you who are just listening and not seeing this on video, I just stuck my tongue out and did the hard rock hand sign. So, what's the connection with the Kiss?
So it's a long story, but I think I can refine it down to about a minute and a half or two. Apart from anything else, I had a long connection in the entertainment business, and particularly the film business, though that has nothing to do with this. I was quite famous for, while I was leading the law firm, for recruiting unusual personalities and people with skills that no lawyer normally would have, but some of them had remarkable business development skills. And so I caught up with a fellow by the name of Keith Stein, who spent many years being a right hand to Frank Stronach at his car part company. And when he left, he was looking for a job in the legal profession. And I convinced him to join us on the basis that we were a different kind of firm that could tolerate a unique personality for someone who actually didn't know very much law, but was extraordinarily well connected. And he's gone on to have a wonderful legal career post the collapse of Heenan Blakey, to his credit. But on his roster was the lead singer of Kiss.
Gene Simmons.
That's right. And
I
Gene
think his
had
name
actually,
is Herschel, isn't it?
as I recall,
I think it's Herschel, yeah.
definitely and was he also Israeli, as I recall? I can't
One
remember the
side.
exact story. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So he had made a few visits to our office in the day. So when I was releasing my first fiction called Odell's Fall, I needed some promotion. Keith and I have kept in touch over the years. We're still very good friends, and he continues to be a promoter. And he was working on a project with Gene, and I said, "Would you do me a favor? Can you get the book into his hands and just do a selfie with him?"
Right.
And so he did it. And as soon as I got it, I put it up on my social media, wondering if anybody was ever going to see it. And you're the first person who's confessed to
absolutely
looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, how cool is that? Because here's a book by a quote ex-lawyer, with the wackiest of the glam rock period, and the guy who's clearly a very bright businessman, who is endorsing your book and does endorse it. It's not just a photograph. He actually endorses it. It's pretty cool. So I wanted to bring that up. I mean, that must have been pretty cool for you.
It was very cool. And it was shortly after I had attended a pitch session that he led in the offices of the firm that we all moved to in the interim and before I finally rewired. And the guy, apart from being a brilliant promoter, is also a very savvy businessman.
Yeah,
and really understands the way the world works.
Yeah.
So it's well hidden by the persona and the makeup, but he's one.
Oh, he's a
brilliant
business guy.
Yeah.
Brilliant businessman. So, looking at this, we talked about this, Gene Simmons promoting your book. We talked about you having this amazing law firm. You've gone on to write 4 books. You've done a TED Talk, etc. There's a lot there. But you and I had talked in previous conversations that that's not really the lad you were. We're talking about the nebbish kid who grows up, right? So talk to us about that personality that somehow found a cocoon in which to break out of and become who you are. Talk to us about the caterpillar version of you that was the beginning.
Well, one line about me says it all in terms of who I used to be. And that's that I always wanted to be a tax lawyer from the time I got to law school. Like, who says that? Like I was the only, I think there were 2 of us in our entire law school class who didn't panic after the first lecture in tax. But I knew at that moment that was going to be my career. But what I didn't realize, I took some advice from some people I trusted who said, listen, when you go to interviews for law firms, just be yourself. And the problem was just being myself got me into the interview and got me 12 rejections. So yeah. I suddenly understood what rejection was all about. Nobody wanted to hire me. Why? Because to be honest, I was the most boring person you'd ever want to meet in an interview. I had no idea of what I had to do, and it wasn't natural to me. And because I'm a natural introvert. So in terms of what changed, it was a combination of 2 things. You began the introduction with a story about water, and it all comes, all of that water imagery comes from a short meeting that I had with my Uncle Harry, who was Harry Bacall. He was a very famous Montreal pediatrician. And I went to visit him after I'd come back from a summer in Europe and just before I started law school. And he was at that point on his deathbed. He was dying of cancer.
Wow.
And at that point, though, he might have been dying, but they still hadn't diagnosed it. And but it was clear to me he didn't have long. And we had a very nice chat. I've been coming to him as a patient since I was about 4 years old. And he looked at me and he said, Norm, and this was completely out of the blue. He said, I've had the most unbelievable career. And he had served in, by the way, he'd served in the Royal Navy. I'd never known that. He served in World War II. He had a desk job because he was a doctor, but insisted on going overseas, and eventually was awarded the Order of the British Empire because Canada still didn't exist.
OBE. Wow.
That's right, an OBE, which no one in the family knew about. He was quite humble in that regard. But he said, I've had a charmed life. He said, and what I did, I want you to think about. He said, because there are a lot of people I know who work very hard to chase an elusive goal. He said, but think of it as putting your boat in the river, and you have a choice. You can paddle hard against the current to reach that elusive goal and find that you arrive there only to be completely exhausted and it's not what you were expecting. Or you can do what I do. Put your boat in the river, follow the current, and steer it. And what you will find is it will show you opportunities you could never possibly imagine. And that message didn't stick with me at all, actually. It probably took 25 years till I was mature enough to understand not only what it meant, but that I'd followed it. So it must have been working in the back of my head somewhere. But that was sort of a key piece of background information on my psychology.
So for that 25 years, you said it took about 25 years to soak in. I can understand that. I'm a slow learner too. But when you look back now, do you think you were paddling upstream the whole time?
No, I was never one to paddle upstream. In fact, I think I followed it, but what I lacked for the first 4 years of my career was the understanding of how to steer that boat. And that piece of wisdom came from my wife. I came home from a review at the end of my 4th year of practice, and my boss, who went on to become my predecessor as leader of the firm, said to me, Norm, he said, you have all the tools in your toolkit to be successful, but there's one problem you have, and I can't tell you what it is, but it's holding you back.
Thanks, mate. That's
exactly.
Fantastic.
I looked at him
That's
like,
so good.
Are
That's
you
so
effing
useful.
insane? I went home. I don't think I've ever been angrier in my life. We had just finished building a house. We had a child. We were in debt up to our ears. So it's not like I was going to leave this place. And I vented to my wife for about 10 minutes. And she then spent the next 4 hours talking to me and propping me up until the word she said finally clicked. She said, Norm, I think what you're missing is you're not showing initiative. Up until now, you've been letting your career happen to you. And I think what Jean is telling you is, like, you need to step up. You need to take charge.
So your boat was in the water. You were going with the current, but you had your oars inside the boat. You were not directing it at all.
It was going wherever anybody else wanted to steer me. I would be happy.
Somebody give you a shove and you go down that way and be like, okay, that's good.
And literally, and you talk about, I've heard people talk about life-changing moments, but for me, I was completely aware that this was a life-changing moment. Like
just her saying you need to take the initiative and you need to steer.
Yeah. And I was able to redirect my anger from my boss to myself. And I made a promise to myself that day I would never let that happen to me again. And what happened was, and again, like when you change a habit, your life's not going to change immediately.
Absolutely.
But you could feel the beginning of change. And I went to the office the next day, and I promised myself from that point forward, I was going to be in charge of everything that happened to me at the firm. And it changed my behavior. It changed how we reacted to things. When opportunities came in, I no longer said, okay, I'll do it. I said, not only am I going to do it, I'm going to be responsible for it. I'm going to drive it forward. And I never, from that point onward, walked into a meeting unprepared for how I was going to take charge of it.
That's really interesting, Norm, because if I sort of stick a pin in that, everybody, let's say 99% of people have something in their lives they want to change. And they maybe even get to the awareness, I need to change this. Something slaps them upside the head, their wife tells them, whatever it is. But that doesn't mean things will change. It doesn't mean that they are going to take the initiative to actually do something. And to be fair to everybody, that's neurochemical. It's built into your brain to do things the way you've always done it. And I would like to finish this first part of the interview by talking about what was the switch, because there's a switch there that's so dramatic that I always say, you got to have the fire on your ass, right? And you've got to, the further you move away from the fire, the less you are likely to take the action. So how do you keep the fire on your ass to say, you know what? I'm really good at just going with the flow and everybody loves me because of it. And I end up in some pretty good places, but I'm not taking initiative. Well, I don't need to take initiative this time. I'll do it next time. Or maybe I'll do it 1 in 3. Or, oh yeah, remember, I'm doing the automatic thing. Oh, I'll correct it next time. It seems, forgive me, it seems like it was pretty dramatic for you and fairly cut and dried. I'm trying to understand that so our listeners can understand that, because I guarantee everybody listening is going, yeah, I really want to change this. And I've tried, I've been to therapy, I've had a coach, I've written some things down, I journaled, I've been pissed off at my mother, whatever it might be. I still find myself going into the old habits.
It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy question to answer. And of course, one of the advantages of 30 years passing is you get to condense all your learning into it's a nice pithy quote that doesn't really help anybody. But I think it's interesting because before I went into law, I spent a year in biochemistry at McGill. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I began to learn both in the biology courses, the chemistry courses, and the psychology courses had to do with the sort of the formation of neurological loops. Yep. That ultimately is what reinforces whatever change you want to achieve. So at a certain intellectual level, I understood it. But at a practical level, it came down to something as simple as, what one thing am I going to do differently today than I did yesterday? Mm. And it was as simple as, because it was that makes it achievable.
Yes.
I'm about to get on a phone call. What am I going to do differently on my phone call that I haven't done before? When I used to walk into a meeting knowing it was someone else's meeting, I was the tax geek sitting in the corner, and they'd call on me to give advice. And I swore from that moment on, I was never doing that again.
Right.
If I was coming into your meeting, I was coming in to run it.
That's awesome.
You want me in your meeting? Fine. I'm not going to be, the little nut and bolt anymore, sitting in the chair waiting to be called on. It's going to become my meeting. And
I love that simple philosophy, because I think that's what stops so many people, is the overwhelm of feeling like, I got to change everything. And you may have to change everything, but not at once. And this simple, there's a great book by the same title, which is called The One Thing. And that is, you pick the one thing you can do right now to make the change, or to make something in the direction of the change. And it doesn't matter if it's big or small, but it tells your brain, we're not doing shit the old way. And I love that. Right. That's fantastic.
That's part of it.
We're already at the end of part 1 of the show, and I want to make sure that people know how to find you and find out about you and the things you do and your speaking and your TEDx and your books and all those kinds of things. Please tell people the best ways that they can reach out to you and find out more about you.
All right. The easiest way to find me is also the hardest because you have to spell my name right. So it's normanbacall.com. Norman Bacall, B-A-C-A-L, all one word, .com as my website where you'll find out everything you need to know about me. You can also find me on LinkedIn as long as you can spell my name right.
Right. And we, of course, will make sure that we post all of the links to how you can get a hold of Norm in the show notes. So we're going to be back in just one click. Until then, and remember, it's just one click and then we'll be back. Until then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about what's happening. Are you putting your boat in the water? When the boat's in the water, are you going with the flow? Are you paddling against the flow of the stream? Or are you putting your boat in the water, going with the flow, but directing your own path? That's a big question. Because when you're in that boat and you're directing it, are you directing it? Or is it some identity? Is it some image? The stuff that Norm talked about at the beginning of the show. We're going to be back in part 2 of this delicious conversation with Norm Bacall, same last name as Lauren Bacall. We'll talk about that too in part 2. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.